Hello and welcome to In Conversation, a dublab podcast where each week we will bring you interviews from the dublab radio archives.
Good morning, friends. It's dublab.com. So glad that you could be here. We are gathering around this campfire of streaming binary code. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning.
Got a very special guest, Jace Clayton in the place, aka DJ Rupture here. My name is Frosty and thrilled to all be together. How are you, Jace?
Yeah, it's great. It's great to actually be in the physical location. You know, the digital campfire is what they get, but then here we are in this totally beautiful studio office workspace.
Physical locations are important, and you've just... We'll just jump right into it because you have just published this wonderful book called Uproot, Travels in 21st Century Music and Digital Culture. And digital culture is this thing that can be very, it can be physical, but it's also many times people kind of disconnected around the world or viewing things through kind of, strange loops and turns and, weird detours. But physical space is still so important.
Yes.
In your kind of travels, are there any moments where you felt, or can you illustrate a moment where that kind of physical community where that was so apparent that, a form of music could only exist because people came together in a space?
Yeah, definitely. I spend, one of the chapters in the book, I talk about time in Cairo and this really interesting new music kids are making there called Festival, Mahraganat. And that's, it started off a little bit before all the Arab Spring stuff happened. But it's this instance of their kids are tuning into YouTube and looking at 50 Cent videos and and so looking at the images and be like, oh, this is what rap is about. So they're hearing that. But then they're tapped into, this all this really interesting music from the 70s in Cairo called Shabi, Ahmed Adewaya, all these people. So very specific, almost like hyper-local musicians. And then they sit down at the laptop and they're like, okay, what are we going to do now? And then once they start making it, it's keyed into that sort of hip-hop thing where it's there's this one crew and they're beefing with another crew. So they just make diss tracks back and forth. And the effect that has is that the music suddenly evolves really quickly because they're there's someone whose mother I need to insult who lives an hour away from here.
Yeah.
So it's super specific, but then there's also always this one ear to this sort of international online sound that they're somehow also communicating with.
Filtering all that kind of wider world noise into their local scene.
Exactly.
It's interesting also the idea of that you're mentioning this kind of almost battle or kind of, diss thing that is fueling, that kind of fire. It's the competition is fueling the kind of creative evolution.
Yep.
I'm wondering if that's something that has always been there. Sound system culture in Jamaica, it would be Treasure Island versus, Trojan, different, whatever different kind of sound systems that were vying for the heat, for the records that were kind of pulling in these R&B records or these, just amazing joints. And that gave cred to your system and kind of pushed it all forward. But even further back, has competition always kind of...
I think so, right? Yeah, competition fuels musical performance. It's this, the wanting to show off, not knowing exactly what you can do to make that. And so you just create and you achieve and you experiment and who knows what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully it continues whatever that evolution is, but also friendly.
Aesthetic competition.
Yeah, aesthetic competition. I'm going to make the ultimate wallpaper. Well, this book is so great. I've been, I'm only halfway through it because I'm juggling with baby books right now because I have a baby coming in a few months. But I feel like it's a good balance. So I'm having one foot in all these spaces on Earth that are making great music through, your great narrative, and then also learning about, how feet grow and brains develop. How long has this kind of been in the works, your book?
It's 4 years. Yeah. And I'd say like the first 2 years were like, awesome, I'm writing a book. I've got a book deal. This is so exciting. I'll make a coffee and go on tour. And then the last 2 years, I was like, oh no, if I don't finish this thing, like I'm changing faster than the book is changing. Like I need to strap myself into this desk and just work.
Yeah.
So,
It feels very contemporary of the now, and it's not dated subject matter, and I feel like you're able to articulate this kind of unique space of information flowing around the world and influencing and affecting the kind of musical currents that are happening. But it does feel like, okay, this is a nice mirror to how it's such a rapid kind of moment of musical growth, probably much more rapid than has ever been experienced on Earth. And it's true for many advancements that this kind of digital technology has allowed. But you've been able to kind of get that timeline and capture these stories that are reflective of that, which is really great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's true what you say. And that's, in a way, that's kind of what prompted the book. I was just kind of realized at some point, I was like, wow, my DJ career has kind of gone hand in hand with all this shift into the digital. Like when I started, it was like vinyl records, and that was kind of it. And or maybe, before you could even really do CDJs, it was just like, okay, touring was weight. Through lugging stuff. And then sort of like crossing into the 2000s, and then very shortly stuff like Serato and USBs and laptops and all these things suddenly became so much more widespread. And I was like, wow, in the past 15 years in which I've been doing this, music has dematerialized in this crazy way, and access has opened up. And so it was thinking that, I've lived through all these changes, like as a working musician. And so let's kind of try and reflect on that in a contemporary way. And like, let's almost just try and kind of like document the now.
There's a moment in the book where you mention that when you've had laptops kind of crash or be lost or whatever, that it's almost a liberation. What is your relationship in general to music and kind of assumed ownership of music, whether it's your record collection or or the digital stuff? Like, is it important to you, or how do you?
Yeah, you mean ownership of like I wrote this song, I own it, or
not intellectual property, but the idea of the physical or digital kind of music, like your library that you've built, and you've built through travels or built through relationships or just built through scouring. Is that important to have that collection, or are we in a world where all that stuff is there and so it's no longer as important to?
Yeah, it's I have a complicated relationship with this stuff, because on the one hand, like I have a very kind of weird, it's almost, I have a DJ's record collection. So I'm like, it's almost like, what can I use, or what sound have I been chasing? But if you look at my records, you'd be like, this doesn't make any sense. It's like, it's because in a sense, like the links are happening in how I'm thinking about how I can insert them into sets or whatever I want to. So there's that. But then when I think about streaming services, I get very depressed, because so much of what I listen to isn't available in those places, which they're very, it's like Spotify, Apple, all these places. It's, you need the album, you need the single, you need to be in a very specific type of formal commercial music infrastructure. And if you're not in that, it's just gone. And so that happens with the bulk of my own DJ mixes. I can't put them on YouTube because it's a million violations, and they don't really exist in those other sort of more overground streaming sites. So I was like, wow, I'm being erased by the digital record. And like, so that's a huge problem.
That is.
And then on the other hand, so much of whenever I travel, I'm interested in, I like this idea of finding out local music wherever I am. So I have like dozens, probably at this point, like hundreds of like Moroccan CDs and cassettes. And none of that it's just kind of there's all these big gaps in the streaming record.
Yep.
So it is, while my own kind of collection is a total like disheveled, like weird sort of black hole. It's also kind of important to have that space because it's so because it doesn't exist anywhere else.
Mm-hmm. It's true. Yeah. There's so much more in the world. I mean, you think about, these ideas of, people tout, the entire volume of human knowledge can fit on the, one microchip or what. I don't even know. But it's not all digitized. It's not all out there. But these things do exist in the world, and they might be in, souk in Morocco, and, like it could be in some dusty kind of back bin. And those are the discoveries that are thrilling, and kind of keep people traveling. So we don't get too far ahead of folks. If you were to kind of give the little elevator pitch, if you met somebody and they had no kind of idea of the kind of context of this world or this book, what would you kind of say this book is about?
Yeah. So I give them the time. Like, the book is called Uproot: Travels in 21st Century Music and Digital Culture.
Or if you were on the end of the Today Show.
Yes. Well, let me tell you. In a way, it's it's narrative nonfiction. But I say I am talking about how all these new developments in technology, from inexpensive laptops to network listening via YouTube, I'm looking at those, how they're changing the way people make and share and understand music all over the globe, but always from a kind of grassroots perspective, So I'm always interested in how music creates social meaning. So there's some talk of the industry, but it's less about that. It's more like there are all these very strange and fantastic new tools. Like, what are some of the joys and what are some of the problems out there in the world right now? And so from my DJ perspective, as someone who's been traveling all over the place, almost 40 countries in the last 15 years or something. And so, looking for flashpoints, and then thinking about these, like I said, this moment, this transitional moment where we're going from.
Well, flashpoints, by kind of definition or nature, are instantaneous and they can explode. So it's interesting to be able to freeze that frame for a second and find out what's happening, why that moment occurred, and what its impact. And I've enjoyed for sure in my journey through this book, reading about it. You've got something queued up that is kind of pertaining to some of the subject matter and some of the stories, and maybe we'll kind of get into the actual story later. But can you introduce the song and the artist?
Let's play. So this is I mentioned Cairo earlier as like this example, like a very place matters so much. It's guys in little sort of like garage studios making diss tracks in this very and so this is this originator of that style, this guy named DJ Figo with a guy named Gandhi, and and so Egyptian festival music from 2002. Here we go.
Wonderful. DJ Rupture, Jace Clayton right here. Special guest on Dublab Celsius Drop. Uproot Travels in 21st Century Music and Digital Culture.
Amir Haha and Gandhi. So totally thrilling, wild sort of music coming out of Cairo, out of these sort of like cement outskirts cities of Cairo. Do
you recall the first time you heard this?
I do. And so it's actually, it's another Radio Magic moment. I had a show on WFMU at New Jersey for a while, 5 years, and a listener in Cairo was like, hey, Rupture, like, I think there's this stuff going on I think you really should check out. And so she sent me a bunch of links. And I have the very first song, which was also same producer, DJ Figo, kind of this originator figure who's the first person to put all those elements together. And then it just clicked with everyone's mind. And this is another diss track. So it's him dissing a fellow producer named Amir Haha. And there's, of course, a ridiculous YouTube video. It's, like Photoshop cutting. It's like his rival pasted in, like his face pasted into all these like totally silly situations.
Wow.
Really funny, interspliced with like belly dancing videos. But this is it.
A lot of effort put into this diss.
Yes. This is serious. But this was the song I heard and I was like, whoa, things are like a new thing is happening there. And so here we go.
Let's check it out.
And there you go. Yeah, that was the gateway drug, as it were.
So good.
Into the world of festival. And it ends with that sort of like ambient, the baby, auto-tuned baby crying meme. That's a little cut at the end of that track.
I almost feel like, his the subject of his diss is not getting the airplay. So at some point we'll have to
yes.
play the flip side.
Air both sides of the story.
It'd be funny if it was just like really, really awful. It was like, actually, DJ Figo, you're right. This other guy sucks. Okay. So you were saying that this was influenced by kind of 70s and 80s sounds?
Yes, yeah. So yeah, this stuff, shabi, which just means basically popular music, but this one kind of key figure, this guy, Ahmed Adewaya. So like working class, kind of like a Egyptian dude with an incredible voice. And then this, so almost like this moment of almost like a kind of like workaday realism, so suddenly he's talking about, instead of this inflated classical language, he's talking about like life on the street, things that the sort of, taxi drivers, waiters, everyone can relate to. And it just took off like wildfire, and in a way it was, and it was very refreshing. The same way that like, early rap was refreshing. These things were like, okay, a new type of language,
Yeah.
That's sort of recognizing the people.
And so is that kind of, it sounds like that's remained important and it's remained, kind of kept its cred. It's interesting because in places frequently there will be kind of musical forms that arise and then they're really discarded and people just say that's, it's old people's music or it's, generation before. But in this case, it sounds like this has remained something important. Do you find that people are listening to this all over the place, the music of the 70s and 80s?
Yeah, that's actually what's kind of great about it, because these guys, when I'm like early 20s, these young producers doing electronic stuff, but they'll still kind of, and they're listening to, of course, all sorts of contemporary music, but they will go back and check these kind of key figures. And actually one of the first, I guess like late 90s New York City DJ named Muda Masik, like really, really great drum and bass and dance hall reggae, but then also working in, like, she was the first person to tell me about Ahmed Adewaya. She's like Egyptian Italian, grew up in the States, but then these were the cassettes that her mother was listening to. But then Julie was like, oh, those are great beats. And then so she started like sampling and cutting them up.
Wow.
And so this track, the Adewaya track I have queued up, he's a lyrical inspiration to the young guys outside of Cairo, but then he's also like a rhythmic and a musical inspiration to a lot of other people. So, yeah.
Cool. Well, let's jump in and let's get a taste of it. DJ Rupture here on Dublab.
Here we go.
And now we're going to kind of bring it a little closer to home and just want to mention that this evening, if you're in Los Angeles or within teleportation distance, you can come on by the Last Bookstore because there's going to be a special happening for Uproot, Jace Clayton's new book. And it's happening at Last Bookstore, 7 to 8:30 p.m. with Dublab's good friend and board member Josh Kuhn. Woo. Lots of guest DJs and including Kid 606, Vicente Pedraza, Shandao. Shandao. Yep. So it's going to be a good time. Cruise on down there. There's more info if you go to lastbookstore.la.com. lastbookstore.la.com. We'll also send a tweet out about it too. So urge you to shuffle your bones on down there and be graced with music from around the world. Get a glimmer of Uproot travels in 21st century music and digital culture, the new book from Jace Clayton, aka DJ Rupture. And speaking of that area downtown LA, you're going to share some cumbia music that's connected to that zone.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first time like hanging out in downtown LA. Actually, shout out to Nguzu. So they knew I was interested in cumbia, and they're like, well, hey, our friend Vincente runs this shop right in Broadway in downtown LA, and they're like, total freedom with DJ and like a live stream. That Barbara Azul was the name of the shop. But so they were kind of they were the gateway, and so they took me down there, and then this amazing little shop, and it was coming from New York City. I was like, it's just like the mind warping. You're like, oh, this is downtown LA. This is wild. It's like I'm trying to process like the urban cityscape, but then spending time with Vincente and just hearing what he's doing as this kind of he's working with all sorts of Mexican cumbia bands in LA, sonideros, moving things around between countries. He also has a store somewhere in Mexico. Really fascinating. And of course, he's got great taste, so he has all the tunes. And so about 2 years ago, I mean, it's kind of like due to the twin pressures of like music industry strangeness, even for like independent Mexican record stores, plus downtown LA real estate pressures. So he had to leave that spot. But I'd always wanted to sort of do something with Vincente. It was such a great figure for me. And so I asked Shandao from Study Arts crew, I was like, hey, would you be interested in working with Vincente today to put out a compilation that kind of documents what he was doing? And so I put them in touch with each other. She's here, and she's like, great. She does a lot of work with cumbia as well. And so that's all kind of coming together. And so tonight for the book party, I'll be like, okay, hey, can you guys play some of the tracks that are coming up for this compilation, which you've been sort of putting together for the last, and the comp will be out later this year on, digital and vinyl, which is pretty exciting.
So can you paint a picture of what the store was like when you walked into that space? Yeah. What were your kind of recollections of it? Yeah, it was, it's like how it was split between, like cell phone stuff, like half music and half cell phone stuff. Yeah. As many of these sort of less music stores are. But then, he had behind a glass counter, there's just all these great CDs. And I actually, not to play favorites, but I'd been to a lot of the other sort of like cumbia labels or Mexican music labels, distributors, both in LA and in New York City. And I instantly was like, oh, this guy has, like, his tastes kind of line up with mine, So a lot of this band called Los Daddies, and he just clearly been nurturing connections with a lot of the bands that had already been moved by. And so I was like, oh, this is really thrilling. He's sort of in the mix and a crucial point of the node of this. But yeah, also a very unassuming store. And for me, it was funny. I'm like, here we are, like on Broadway. On Broadway. Yeah. Not that Broadway. Yeah. And I was like, this is such a, I don't know. It was just, it was really great. And also something about the openness, just like some weirdo from New York who just comes in and like asking him these sort of geeky questions and being sort of totally gracious about it. So that made a wonderful impression as well. And was most of the music that he was selling there contemporary? Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So all contemporary, all compilations, and some of it will be from bands around a producer. Some of it be like Cumbia con Acordeon Volume 7. Like a lot of these sort of like repackaged comps, and all different types of like electronically produced Mexican cumbias, which have this huge big debt to sort of Colombian cumbias with great bass lines, the sort of melodic minor key, accordion or synth patterns, and all of this. Yeah. Wow. Well, let's hear a bit of it. What's this tune? So this is Los Daddies, and this is Cumbia del Alba. So a really beautiful, kind of almost wistful cumbia here. Shout out to Vincente Pedraza of Barba Azul.
Órale, Itani, goza la cumbia. Y en Los Ángeles, discos Barba Azul. Impresionante.
Grupo Hui Hui.
Sounds so good. Grupo Huri Huri?
Hui Hui.
Hui Hui.
Yeah, Karawai, sort of covering kind of like an Andean song, maybe, with their weird synthesizer settings.
And so is this also from the same shop or something that...
It is. Yeah. And so in the first song I played, out of these last two, the Cumbia Los Daddies, the first thing he says, he's like, he gives a shout out to Vincente Pedraza and Barba Azul, says Los Angeles, Los Angeles. And then this was just part of the Hui's part of the Barba Azul universe. So
And so were you got these CDs at the shop and then going home and just kind of what were your thoughts as you were digging through these and listening to the tunes?
Yeah, it was it's this kind of this beautiful thing because the culture of cumbia, it's all about versions. A lot of groups sort of just doing their interpretations and of course all the shout out stuff. But people like Vicente Pedraza serve this really important role, as this kind of the person who's kind of spreading the word, and just helping it exist. And so it actually made me think about almost like, what do you need for a good musical ecosystem, right? Like you need someone who's sweating it out in the like selling cell phones and SIM cards, but then also has a lot of his life invested in sort of helping the scene move around and being in touch with itself. And
when you walked into his shop, if you hadn't been introduced to that space and you just kind of walked into it, would you have immediately thought it was a record store or a cell phone shop? Where would you kind of tilt?
That's funny. Yeah, more of a cell phone shop, like someone just kind of like, sort of like cheap electronics store. Like so much, you'll pass by these in all sorts of downtowns all over the world. You're like, it's just some sort of place. Like I don't need a strobe light. I don't need a new phone. I'm not going to go in. And so that's actually really key. Like unless I had friends who took me there and they're like, no, this is the guy, this is the spot. It would have been so easy to just overlook and walk by. And so I feel like that was my first kind of like LA lesson, insofar as I think this city, at least for me, maybe even more than most, has these you go down the alley, you turn a corner, there's some incredible thing, it's like, I kind of think of it as very narrative in that way. You need to someone tells you where to go and then you go there and then it's what you see is not what you get. Yeah. And that was so true with this guy, this incredible cache of CDs, and I'm always digging for cumbia. And then I get, I walk away with 10 CDs and I'm like, these are all great. I need to return.
Need to go back. Well, it's good you've got these spots around the world. Unfortunately, some of them do disappear, for whatever reason. But, so if you had been doing this research and these studies and this exploration simply from behind your laptop screen, this book wouldn't be possible, and what you're creating musically and sharing with the world wouldn't be possible. I mean, is it absolutely essential to also be in a physical space and to move with a guide to these kind of, back alley shops? And
I think it is. And of course, it's like I realized that being able to travel as a DJ is like this huge honor and a privilege, but then no matter what, I'm thinking of like growing up in Boston, like going out of my, taking like 3 buses to go to the reggae shops, things like that. I'm like, and so the being in the world, and all of a sudden it's like the energy in the room changes, the information you're getting, suddenly it's like, it's full bandwidth information, weird little nuances, and it's this kind of, it's always in your face that it's never just about the music. It's never just about the bits. It's how do those bits exist in the world and the people in the moves of the dances of the, of those who make this music, and it goes on. And that's what's, of course I love listening to weirds. I love switching on the radio, not knowing what station I'm listening to, not knowing what I'm hearing. Like that's magic. But that magic would mean less if I didn't have the opportunity to then get some sort of thread of information and context and bring it home in a way. And so in a way, it's like, for me, it's ultimately this kind of call to explore where you live. It's like you're walking by a place and there's interesting music coming up out of an open window. It's like, well, maybe you should ask what that is. Maybe, yeah.
Can you kind of let flash back a bit and rewind to maybe early epiphanies? What was, because we're kind of born into a world frequently that is pretty narrow casted, and what. Some people are, many people are like, here's what you should like, or here's how we do things, or here's, what music sounds like. What was kind of an early, very important epiphany for you to kind of have that world broken open and to realize that there was much more than meets the ear?
Yeah, it was, I have to say, like, shout out to to radio, like Boston area college radio stations. So critical, because
actually, I want to diss radio. I've got a diss battle going on.
You suck. Oh yeah, but for like this thing of back then, just like being able to switch it on, and that was like kind of this lifeline. And I remember one day, even like kind of, I guess it was like a corporate station, but then this British band Stump had broken up that day, and so I must have been in middle school, and they were just like, yeah, shout out to this band Stump that like broke up, like we're gonna play one song, and the song was Charlton Heston, so like a very strange, like super quirky, but this song was based around samples of frogs with all these weird rhymes, like fretless, but so all these like very odd production, and that thing of like, oh, this is in the middle of a station that played mostly like sort of indie rock or whatever. I was just like, what are those sounds? Those sounds are coming from what's ordinarily like we're a band, we play chords kind of music station. And that, I remember however old I was, 13 or something, I was like, this is crazy, because this is possible, and it wasn't sampling like at all like I'd heard before. And so these weird little epiphanies where it's maybe even less that like the specific object, but more like an object that says, oh, this thing is not like the others, but it's possible. It's made its own rules.
Yeah. And now our kind of pathways to these things are a lot more open. And, and when I mentioned before, the kind of sitting behind the screen of a laptop and exploring, that's a pretty powerful thing too. We can definitely travel far through our screens and through the great efforts of people sharing music. But the actual community aspect and the human aspect and the stories behind that music. And what I found interesting in your book, you're talking about, there's a chapter where you're talking about Konono number 1, you're talking about Omar Suleiman and stuff. And fetishization of music, and but also maybe the lack of going deeper with it, the tendency for people to want to package something for kind of photo value, aesthetic value, but then to not tell the stories. And it's important for people to say, let's tell the stories behind the music. Can be viscerally interesting and impactful, but what are they saying? I mean, because if they are saying it, it must mean something. It's brought them to say this on the air, and so it's important to go further with it. And so shout out to all the bloggers and journalists and music freaks and geeks out there in the world who are kind of digging into what this stuff means. Yeah.
And Konodo's, I mean, obviously I bring it up as an example, but like looking through and realizing, I'm like, they've never translated any of these lyrics, like however many albums Cram's put out. I'm like, that's this weird form of disrespect ultimately. And
it's wild because but it's great that it's out there. It's available, but it should go a step further. And there's people who do take it steps further, and hopefully the actions of kind of the thoughtful labels and people who are putting in the effort into these kind of liner notes or web resources, that's not overlooked. It's a step that's it takes a lot of effort.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, and it's funny. It's true. Most of it's like uncompensated effort. It is like the blogger person who's out there really digging, or the person at the label who says, "Oh, we could just package this and say sell the story in the photo, or we could find, or we could put in an extra week of work and then have." That's it. It does turn into this sort of labor of love, precisely because it's so easy to just consume music, and so like joyful just to consume music. But the stories are always make it more interesting.
Totally.
To me, musicians are weirdos. Like, talk to them.
This is true. Well, let's continue exploring the works of weirdos. Again, we've got Jace Clayton, aka DJ Rupture, right here, my special guest on Celsius. Dropped today his new book, Uproot: Travels in 21st Century Music and Digital Culture. Is really great and has kind of it's been wonderful reading material for me. He's in Los Angeles tonight, the Last Bookstore special event, and if you're in LA, you can cruise on by lastbookstorela.com. You'll find out more info there. And exploring these mutant forms. I mean, this is West African music played by a Japanese ensemble. and
Awesome.
these things are, it's like, music is fluid and music influence.
What's the ensemble?
Mkwaju ensemble.
Mkwaju.
Yeah,
Wow.
they're great. And prior to that was Francis Bebe from Cameroon, who he wrote a book just called African Music, and he wrote
a
several
book?
books.
Wow.
Oh yeah,
I
he was deep guy and really dispelled a lot of kind of like misconceptions of African music and really interesting. But so good work being done by people who want to go further and make sure that people understand, and that's what we're trying to do here. What's up next?
So talking about, the musicians are weirdos. This is a consummate weirdo. And by weirdo, I just mean that I'm going to play, Hassan Wargi is the name of this musician. So a Berber musician, lives in Casablanca, Morocco. And I met him from going there and doing research from the book and finding his CD in a stand and then hearing it. And I was like, this is really like idiosyncratic and gorgeous, banjoist, singer, producer. But he knows he's a good musician, and he knows he's got this vision, but he's in a country, in a context that doesn't really have a space for sort of independent musicians, like venues. It's not really, there's sort of no infrastructural support.
Does it have a real hyper-local kind of, is it within the Berber communities? Is it important and accepted, as far as like, are they playing weddings? Are they playing functions? Are they playing in the town? Mm-hmm. Is it that there's a ceiling to it, or? Yeah,
that there's like functions, definitely, weddings and things like that for sure. But then what you play there, it's very much like, it's almost like standards, like a wedding DJ here, like you need to play Madonna and Beyonce. It's kind of like that, just with sort of Berber songs. And then he's like, no, I believe in poetry, and there are always bands that can sort of exist outside this, but it's really kind of this, like, I was like, where can you play in Casablanca? You live in a city of 4 million people. And he's like, nowhere. It's like, there's not like a coffee house scene. It's kind of like weird bars or weddings and other sort of like very much formal gatherings, which you can do, but that's not his love.
That's a city, I haven't been there, but it sounds like it's a pretty industrial, hustle bustle place.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Whereas, Fez or Marrakesh are these places that are a larger amount of tourists moving forward, or Tangier, but people are working.
Yes.
So they're working, they're doing their things. Is it a hard place for a musician to? It
is a hard place. It's the center of the music industry.
The music industry,
But then if you, but that said, it's like the very much, it's almost like there's only a commercial music industry. And so in the edges, it becomes incredibly difficult because it's this sort of just struggle to kind of, to get your voice heard in a way.
And you're helping him get his voice heard.
Yeah, actually, and so here we go. And so he's been WhatsApping me songs. He has a group called Imanaren, Imanren, and so actually I just helped him like get that onto Bandcamp. I'm like, this is a great album. Like, this is what you need to do.
Great.
Bam. So that happens, and then he's been. I'm going there to Casablanca to do some research, interview some more musicians soon. And he's like, hey. So he's been WhatsApping me these like kind of home demos of these new songs. But so this is, I don't even know what this is. This is from September 25th.
Perfect. Hey,
Hassan Wargi.
Hot off the press.
Track number 4 from September 25th. World debut.
Here we go.
Keep it frosty.
Loving this music from Morocco. Hassan Wargi?
Yes, Hassan Wargi. And the first one was him under his own name, and the second one was, that's the one that's out there in the digitals called Imanaren, his project, which is effectively him.
Imanaren.
Yeah. But that second one was the one I heard in a store, and I was like, I got to contact this guy. This is really, really special. And bam.
Yeah.
So it began.
Yeah, it's so good. And so how long have you been acquainted with him?
Wow, like 5 years now. Yeah, and actually that's a funny story because I bought the CD, of course. I'm like, this is awesome. And then there's a phone number on the back. And so I was with a Moroccan friend and I was like, hey, can you call this and explain? And he called it. And then the guy was like, what? And the guy was just like, what do you mean you like my music? And he literally hung up on my buddy.
Do you think it was like a prank?
It was somehow it was like Hassan's cousin or a friend of his.
Oh.
But then the whole idea, like he thought it was a prank.
Wow.
And so it wasn't a musician. I'm like, that's weird. Like call again the next day. And so eventually we called and like Hassan picked up.
Wow.
and then a few weeks later we had coffee and then we sort of became friends.
So how many times have you traveled now to Morocco?
That's good. I guess I've probably been there for like 2 or 3 months overall. And, as we were talking off mic before, an incredibly useful aspect of like is budget flights from Europe, And so like I remember going from like I was DJing in Milan, then I was like, I've got a 4-day window. I can just take the whatever cheap air express for 70 euros. All of a sudden I'm there. And once you're there, it's also, you can get by pretty easily. So, so I think it's 2011 and 12 were like the main times, but I'm trying to sort of, I'm interested as part of this thing of like this commitment to place. It's also not about going to endless new places. It's like, let's try and cultivate some like lasting relationships in this one specific place.
Yeah, it's not all about collect them all kind of thing, like get it all. And it's about friendships and, respecting that human connection and building that. And then you start to get deeper. What's interesting sometimes is that I find sometimes musicians put forward what they think you might like, but you can be very interested in something they feel that you might have no interest in. So there's always these kind of side projects or experiments or things that are sometimes like really illuminating. Somebody, who's a wild psychedelic rock musician, their kind of lute music might be the most interesting thing. So it's that time spent can reap benefits.
Absolutely. It's funny because funny that you mentioned that, because a lot of my time there in Morocco is like writing for the chapter in the book, and that in there I'm like basically trying to get to the bottom of like how come autotune is so popular here. But then a lot of the musicians I talk to, they're like, don't talk to that musician. That musician's terrible. Like, why are you interested in this? Like, you should listen. So I got this all like, you should listen to this instead, again and again. They're like this weird foreigner with bad taste in music.
That is funny. Oh man. And what about, because there's a really interesting thing in your book, this idea of, the commercial industry tagging world music and kind of creating this idea of genre. So there's this idea of world music, but the United States is part of the world, and this stuff kind of exists everywhere, and regional music forms are so interesting. What have you found kind of on the homegrown level recently that's been interesting you?
Yeah, let's see. Yeah, what's bumping in New York? Actually, this is it's in the air, which is Dominican dembo. And shout out to Julianne Escobedo Shepherd. We were talking about this 2 weeks ago. I was like, what are you listening to? She's like, dembo, the past 2 years. And it was one of these moments where I often pay attention to it, but I'd been, my head had been in like bookland for a while. Yeah. And then so after having spoken with her, I'm like, oh yeah, let's check in. Like I'm doing, and it's this instance where, so it's almost like a sped up reggaeton, just loosely. But in the past 5 or 6 years, it actually keeps on developing. So there's more space. There's sort of more, I wouldn't say better production, but like there's integrating bass in more interesting ways. It's less about rapping and more about melodic singing. And so I was like, wow, this genre is opening up. And because, of course, this whole New York to Dominican Republic connection is really strong, it's very much like this kind of, there are artists up doing it in Washington Heights and uptown Manhattan, and there's Washington doing it down in the DR. So that's kind of in the air in New York City. That just gets more and more exciting from month to month, it seems.
That's so interesting. Well, people can dive into it. It's all out there in the world. And we're playing right now. This is Carl Craig, editor of the Congo's Congo Man. And in your book, Uproot, you travel to Jamaica and you spend some time with the Congos for a sneak peek. For those who haven't yet read the book, we'll get them excited. What was it like when you first met the Congos, and can you tell us about their kind of complex and?
Yeah, that was it's for me going to after lifelong fan of Jamaican music. And then to suddenly you're like, oh, here I am, like in the heart of it all. Like this is actually kind of wild and amazing. And as I say in the book, I'm like, all the things you hear about, the birth of sound system culture and remix, and it's all there. And actually, the Congos in particular, they're where like Ashanti Roy lives. It's literally a compound. It's like murals of themselves covering the wall. It's just full on sort of like Rasta mythology.
You should come over to my house. You'll see it.
Yeah, it's like
murals, holograms.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm like, this is the Last Supper, except they're members of the Congos, and there is Malcolm X, and there's a bong on the table, and just like, this is really intense.
Yeah.
Because for all sorts of reasons. And it was there in Christmas time. Of course, it's tropical. It's really hot. And I have to say, I was there because of this great project that Sana Ra and
Geddes Jingris,
they did working with the Congos. And
shout out to Revenge International, Freakways.
Yeah, that was great. But the thing, the ultimate, like beyond all this sort of like Rastafarian mysticism, and like here I am, this amazing hyper creative hoppative musical activity, was the just what I'm calling like the kind of like the ethos of listening. There's so much advanced listening going on in Jamaica, and I think being outside the country, being outside Kingston, you can be like, yes, of course, reggae music, amazing, but something there, I was like, I understand much more clearly now the relationships between like really keyed in audiences who know the history, who know how to respond, who are active in selecting and championing and thinking about it. And so one day at the Congos, it was just their neighbor, over like a little cement wall, was playing some sort of mixtape of hip like rap, but I'm like, this is early 2000s, mostly East Coast, mostly New York City rap, and I'm like, this
rap that would be played on commercial radio or more on kind of like underground mix shows.
More like underground mix shows. That's the thing. It was like maybe the most commercial thing was like a Cassidy track, I'm a Hustler, like put out on Jay-Z's label. But I was just like, and I was of course buying hip hop like mad at the time, so I knew all these songs, but I was just thinking to myself, like what is it? Like, how can you get such a specific, very specific selection? Like, clearly human selected. No algorithm
Jace,
can come up with that.
This is your life.
Yes, and it's just over the wall. And here we are, sort of on the outskirts of Kingston. But then later on, going to street dances and seeing people's reactions to playing American oldies, say from the 70s, and even just sort of driving around and tuning into the radio. At the end of the day, I was like, this is a culture of very interesting, very public listening, but incredibly thoughtful listening. And so I was trying to kind of think through that throughout the writing of the chapter. Thoughtful
listening is a good thing. And you're here in Los Angeles tonight. You're going to be doing this in-store happening at the Last Bookstore, but then also tomorrow night you're playing the Perpetual Dawn Party put on by Kid 606 with Sana Ra, with Geddes Jingris, SK Kakraba, lots of good folks. So people can Google that, Perpetual Dawn, DJ Rupture, and come be part of a thoughtful listening experience.
Yeah, all-nighter in downtown LA.
So do you have a Congos piece lined up for us, or what do you have?
Yeah, I think this is actually, yes. So Fisherman, classic track produced by Lee Perry. But another funny moment in the compound was like the Roy, the Condi is the sort of one of the Congo vocalists has it on his ringtone. So I'm like, oh, that's Fisherman, but it seems very tinny. And then he just whips out his phone and goes, Fire Burn.
Amazing.
Wow. I was like, this man answers his phone by saying Fire Burn. After the Fisherman squeezed into a ringtone. I'm like, this is what it's all about.
Wow.
And another thing, actually, as we listening to the lyrics, they talk about like a seaport town and all of this. I'm like, oh yeah, they really did come from like a small, like very humble fishing town, you know, like these fishing shanties. Like we were sort of spending some time along there. And so there's something very sort of sublime music from very kind of hard scrabble, like very real situations.
Yeah. Wow. So great.
So, yeah.
Well, let's hear Congo's Fisherman, DJ Rupture, right here on dublab.com. How long have the Congos been active?
Wow. I want to say late 60s. And they just kind of kept on going.
Wow.
Yeah.
What's so interesting is that, you know, with Jamaican music, Jamaican popular music, you know, even Minto and ska, dub, reggae, dancehall stuff, you know, we're fortunate to have the originators, many of them still here with us. Many of them have passed, but, you know, to have this kind of living historical record and document to be able to connect with them. Were you going to Jamaica to kind of get this oral history and to kind of get it straight from the source in a way?
Yeah, much more crude than that. Like I was being paid money by the Fader magazine.
Cool.
But I think actually it's funny, like the conversation with the editor at the time, he's like, you know, he's like, oh, we actually discussed, because there's something about you're like with dealing with these sort of like iconic figures, you know, and he's like, you're probably kind of, I think he realized my, I don't want to say I'm not, obviously I'm respectable, but I'm not like, oh man, like I'm not putting musicians up on this weird pedestal, which can actually make things hard to write about in a way which is useful to anyone. Yeah. So he was just like, yeah, would you be up to sort of go there and see what's going on? Yeah, and it was certainly took that as an opportunity, precisely because there is so much, like, you know, so much like self-made mysticism on their part, but like, you know, the aura, the clouds of smoke. But at the end of the day, you're like, well, let's talk about how these musicians are getting together to make this like strangely beautiful music. And that really, the collaboration was actually really great and kind of wild, and seeing how it all came together. So yeah.
Is there something that is kind of universal amongst these musicians that you've met in your travels for your book Uproot or your travels DJing that kind of ties it all together?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to say, like, at a very basic level, you know, it's like if musicians are singing, they generally like you to know what they're singing about. Yeah. But I think that one of the things that is, you know, approaching this sort of universal thing is that music is so, it's so open, you know, it's something that evolves in conversation, you know, it's like one person picks up a drum, the other person picks up an instrument, and then they can start playing. And so I feel quite fortunate, you know, I'm not chasing after the sort of pop stars. And so I'm always drawn to people who are really kind of engaged in that form. And it's so open to this sort of collaboration and outward facing. So yeah, I feel like musicians have a kind of a wide cultural interface, wider than most. That's how I think about it.
When given the opportunity to do something outside of the norm, you know, it seems that most kind of creative musicians, people who are outside of that kind of pop sphere, do embrace that opportunity. And you've had the opportunity to do that and do lots of traveling through music, but going to, you know, kind of Morocco or other spaces and kind of bringing together different types of music into one space and kind of creating new hybrids or new things.
Actually, that's something we could play. We go, ooh, the last minute. So what is it? Early September, a month ago, I actually did this gigantic 20 musician performance in this museum in Philadelphia called the Barnes Foundation. And it was precisely that. And at a level which it's, you know, I've been so busy since then that I haven't had time to process it and like remember what I did. But I'm like, oh yeah, that happened. And so this was this instance. In a way, it's from the people who know me from the DJ work and whatever. They said, hey, would you like to do something that responds to this very eclectic, very idiosyncratic collection of artwork that this guy Albert Barnes put together, which will bring together like European sort of painting, you know, Impressionist and Picasso, but then like, you know, African statues and then Amish woodwork and this kind of it's like one dude's very, very, you know, he's doing this in the 20s and 1930s. One dude's very interesting ideas on arrangements and curating, and sort of like, oh, reflect on that somehow musically? Sure. And so I brought in, I worked with an amazing self-directed string ensemble in Philadelphia, 15 members, called the Prometheus Chamber Orchestra. I brought up a fantastic musician from DC, Ethiopian, named Gazachu Habtemariam, a voice, and Masinko, one-string fiddle. I was able to bring over the lead singer and guitarist from this band, The X, a Dutch band, The X, really interesting sort of post-punk, broadly speaking.
Who've done a lot of collaborations with musicians based in Africa, including Kanona Number One and... Yeah, them and some Emily Manzo and Benjamin Lee from New York. So all these different elements came together, and I was kind of, in a way, I was like DJing in the broadest sense. You know, I was sort of like combining, doing arrangements, and it happened in this very big atrium space. So 700 people, like a really, really big room with gigantic ceilings, and right next to the collection. So they were like, you can't have any subwoofers. You know, the speakers they can only face this way. They can't even face the walls where some prints are being stored. And so all these really interesting sort of sonic conditions that I was like, okay, let's work with these conditions, you know. And so the piece was like no beats whatsoever, primarily unamplified, but then I would have things like asking the string orchestra, I'm like, would you guys mind like chanting, you know, like singing the chorus in this song, and even some... No, man, we're self-directed.
Yeah. Even that, you're like, oh, who do we talk to? It's the self-directed. But yeah, great. You know, it turns out this, you know, self-directed means just like actually really amazing to watch this sort of like their decision-making process and like how they'll like go through a piece and just kind of converse with each other.
Wonderful.
Yeah. And again, this spirit of collaboration. So they were like super, I mean, I have to say, like a lot of classical musicians can be very precious. Like, give me the score, I interpret the score. Whereas this was, I mean, a lot of it was scored, but it was much more open. And they were correspondingly open. And so that was a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Let's take a listen.
Yeah, I'm trying to now. I just need to locate it. My digital housekeeping is very messy, very messy. So
I'm in a similar world.
But it's great. So let me see. Oh, I know it's stage. It's just like watch out for your metadata. That's basically the okay, found it. Stage. So, man, what should I be? Okay, I will play. I can play a bit of the beginning.
Sounds good.
And in the beginning, so to set the stage, this big hall, on one end, there's, I began with Prometheus, the 15-member. They're playing Ravel, which this collector loved, like a piece in his collection. And then about halfway through Prometheus's arrangement of this Ravel string quartet, I asked Arnold from Zaya, from the X, say, hey, I know you do this amazing cover of a Leadbelly song, Bourgeois Blues, kind of with this African guitar line. I'm like, can you start playing this at the other end? And then, you know, and the audience will sort of be in the middle, and then they can choose to focus on whatever they want to focus on. So I can play this sort of weird crossfade concert opening scenario. I'm going to skip around, so you get to hear me skipping around. But
let's check it out. Special guest Jace Clayton here on dublab. Yeah.
Unidentified maker. People sketching. Unidentified maker.
That was again the Barnes collection in Philadelphia.
Yep.
Correct. And then are they building an archive of some of these projects that they're doing currently? Is this stuff somehow existing within their collection?
With this particular performance piece, actually it's working with curator Lee Tussman. Shout out to DJ. It's like 12 Celia's DJ.
$3.33. Yeah, $3.33. Yeah. Celia Hollander.
But yeah, so with this Room 21, I'm like, okay, this is, you know, it's a piece very much explicitly in dialogue with the collection. And then back, you know, when he was alive, Barnes, you needed to write him a letter to ask to like tell him, explaining to him why you wanted to see this amazing collection of art he had. And he was like a sort of like a rascally, wily guy. So he like rejected T.S. Eliot famously. So he'd be like, you like mainstream intellectual? No. He's like, I want like school kids and I want
Very
workers.
cool.
So like this really, and so with this, I'm like, we're making a digital archive. Like we filmed it. There's, this is an open mic recording is what we just heard, but the sound quality is nicely representative. Images. So we're going to have a digital archive, but the same process will be enacted. You'll need to write me an email and you'll be either accepted or rejected to then sort of experience the archival version of Room 21.
Wow. If you're somehow related to T.S. Eliot, just don't bother. There's already a filter set up for that, a spam filter. That's great. And again, the total number of musicians or participants in that?
Yeah, it was 20, 21.
Wow.
From a voice actor who's reading the entire contents, the catalog of contents, to all these people. It was epic. I was joking with my friend Helado Negro, a great musician who's done a lot of, like last year, the year before, he did a big same thing, and we're just like, it's like more musicians, more problems. It's like a joke, it's like super exciting up, but you're like, wow, that's a lot of things to think about.
Yeah. Shout out to Roberto
Yes.
Roberto Carlos Lange, good cat. And shout out to Jace Clayton, who's sitting right here. I'm giving you a direct shout out. And your book, Uproot, Travels in 21st Century Musical, boom, 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 and Digital Culture is so good. And tonight at the Last Bookstore, if we stoked your appetite for more, in conversation with Josh Kuhn, Jace will be down there speaking with Josh Kuhn, plus a bunch of DJ sets, Shandao, Vicente Pedraza from Barba Azul, Kid 606, and more. Urge you to cruise on down there. And the Last Bookstore is
amazing.
Such a great space.
Totally amazing.
Cruise on down there, and be sure to cruise upstairs as well, because it's really a magical place. And hope you all check that out. Check out the book, which is out now, and
Uprootbook.com.
Yay! Uprootbook.com.
And there's a listening guide there too. So
yes, it's such a fun read, and the narrative nonfiction style and vibe it's fun. It's a good story, and really Jace brings you through some really vivid lands. So check it out. Get your dog ear your copy now. You'll be flipping through it with vigor.
In Conversation was produced by Dublab, a nonprofit radio station broadcasting live from Los Angeles since 1999. Sound editing and theme song by Matea Baim. For more programming, visit dublab.com. And thank you for listening.